Before the kings came. Before the long and complicated era of Israel's monarchy, with all its glory and its catastrophic failure, its moments of breathtaking covenant faithfulness and its seasons of devastating spiritual collapse, there was a transition. A hinge moment in the history of God's people when everything that had been was giving way to everything that was about to be. The period of the judges was ending. The period of the kings had not yet begun. And in the space between those two eras, in the gap that history always creates between what has been and what is coming, God needed a voice. A human voice. A voice that could hear what heaven was saying and speak it into the earth with the clarity and the authority and the faithfulness that the moment required. And God found that voice in the most unexpected of places. Not in the court of a powerful man. Not in the school of the established priests. Not in the ranks of the existing religious leadership whose moral condition had made them part of the problem rather than part of the solution. God found his voice in a boy. A boy sleeping in a temple. A boy who did not yet know the Lord, who did not yet know what it meant to hear the divine voice speaking directly to a human soul. A boy who, when the voice came, ran to the wrong person 3 times before anyone understood what was actually happening. And that boy's name was Samuel. His story begins, as so many of the most significant stories in the biblical narrative begin, not with him but with his mother. With a woman whose anguish and whose prayer and whose faithfulness created the conditions for the extraordinary life that followed. Hannah. The name means grace or favor. And she needed both. Because Hannah, the wife of a man named Elkanah from the hill country of Ephraim, could not have children. 1 Samuel 1 verse 2, in the ancient world, in the social and cultural and theological framework of ancient Israel, barrenness was not merely a medical condition. It was a source of grief so profound and social shame so comprehensive that it touched every dimension of a woman's existence. Her identity was bound up in her capacity to bear children. Her security depended on the sons who would care for her in old age. Her standing in the community was inseparable from her role as a mother. And Hannah had none of it. Year after year, the wife of Elkanah who could bear children, Peninnah, his other wife, had sons and daughters. And Hannah had nothing. And her rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her, because the Lord had closed her womb. 1 Samuel 1 verse 6, her rival. Peninnah. The other wife in the household who had what Hannah did not have and who apparently made certain that Hannah was never allowed to forget it. She provoked her grievously. Year after year, in the most intimate and unavoidable space of shared domestic life, Hannah was subjected to the deliberate, targeted provocation of a woman who used Hannah's most painful reality as a weapon against her. And the pain of that provocation was compounded by the theological dimension that the ancient world gave to barrenness: the Lord had closed her womb. In Hannah's understanding, her childlessness was not merely biological misfortune. It was something God had done. Or not done. Something about her situation that implicated the God she worshipped and the covenant she was part of in ways she could not understand or accept. Year by year, when they went up to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, Peninnah would provoke her. And Hannah wept and would not eat. 1 Samuel 1 verse 7, Shiloh. The place where the tabernacle had been set up after the conquest of Canaan, the location of the Ark of the Covenant, the center of Israelite worship in the period of the Judges, the place where the family of Elkanah went annually to offer sacrifices to the Lord. The sacred space that should have been the place of encounter and blessing and the renewal of covenant relationship became, year after year, the place where Hannah's grief was most acute and Peninnah's provocation most painful. She wept. She would not eat. The grief was total and consuming and visible enough that Elkanah, who loved her, noticed and tried in his limited and somewhat clumsy way to address it. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, "Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" 1 Samuel 1 verse 8, Am I not more to you than 10 sons? The question of a man who loved his wife but did not fully understand her pain, who offered himself as a substitute for what she lacked without grasping that the ache of childlessness was not an ache that a husband's love, however genuine, could fill. His question was well-intentioned and somewhat tone-deaf in the way that well-intentioned responses to specific grief often are. Hannah did not answer him. She rose and went to the temple. After they had eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. 1 Samuel 1 verses 9-10, she wept bitterly. The prayer of Hannah at the temple in Shiloh was not the composed, theologically structured prayer of a woman who had her grief under control and was approaching God with appropriate decorum. It was the prayer of a woman who had been broken open by years of pain, who came to the temple not with composure but with tears, not with carefully chosen words but with the raw and desperate outpouring of a heart that had nowhere else to go. She wept bitterly. And she prayed. And she made a vow. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. 1 Samuel 1 verse 11, the vow of Hannah is one of the most extraordinary prayers in the entire Old Testament. Not for its theological sophistication, it is not a sophisticated prayer. Not for its literary beauty, it is not a beautifully crafted prayer. It is extraordinary for its honesty and its cost. She asked God for a son. And in the same breath, in the same sentence, she gave the son back. She had not yet received him and she was already releasing him. She asked for the thing she most wanted in the world and simultaneously committed herself to giving that thing to God for the whole of his life. The Nazirite vow, no razor shall touch his head, placed the child she was asking for in the same category of consecrated dedication to God as Samson, connecting the unborn son of Hannah's prayer to the covenant framework of lives set apart for divine purpose. She prayed so long and so intensely, moving her lips but making no sound. The prayer was too deep for audible words, the communication between her soul and God too personal and too agonized for the social performance of voiced prayer, that the old priest Eli, watching her from his seat by the doorpost, concluded she was drunk. 1 Samuel 1 verse 13, he said to her, How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. The priest whose job it was to be the spiritual guardian of the people of God, the man whose role required sensitivity to genuine spiritual distress, mistook the most sincere prayer being offered in Israel at that moment for public intoxication. The observation about Eli is not incidental. It is the first quiet indication of the spiritual condition of the established priesthood, the condition that the rest of Samuel's story would address with devastating clarity. And Hannah answered, No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. 1 Samuel 1 verses 15-16, pouring out my soul before the Lord. The phrase Hannah used to describe her prayer became one of the most important descriptions of authentic prayer in the entire biblical vocabulary. Not performing prayer. Not reciting prayer. Pouring out the soul, the complete, unfiltered, unguarded emptying of everything that was within her before the God who already knew it all but whose knowing became real for her in the act of the pouring. Then Eli answered, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. 1 Samuel 1 verse 17, and she said, Let your servant find favor in your eyes. Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. 1 Samuel 1 verse 18, her face was no longer sad. Before anything had changed externally. Before any physical evidence that the prayer had been heard. Before any sign or confirmation beyond the words of an old priest who had just accused her of being drunk, her face was no longer sad. Something had happened in the pouring out that could not be explained by anything other than the reality of the God she had poured herself out before. She had given her grief to God. And the grief that had consumed her appetite and her composure and her capacity to eat at the sacred meal, that grief had been taken from her. Not because her circumstances had changed. Because she had been with God. And being with God, genuinely, completely, without pretense or performance, being with God in the full reality of her pain, had done what nothing else had been able to do. And they rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord and then went back to their house at Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. 1 Samuel 1 verse 19, the Lord remembered her. The same language used of God remembering Noah in the ark. The same language of active divine turning toward a person in covenant mercy, the remembering that is not the end of forgetfulness but the beginning of purposeful action. God remembered Hannah. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. 1 Samuel 1 verse 20. Samuel. The name contains within it the Hebrew for asked of God, or heard by God. The interpretations are closely related and both carry the meaning of a child whose existence is the answer to a prayer. He was the asked for one. The prayed for one. The child whose mother had wept so bitterly in the temple and given him back to God before she received him. He was not merely a gift from God to Hannah. He was a gift from Hannah back to God, a life consecrated before it began, dedicated before it was born, given away before it was received. And from the very beginning, before he had done anything, before he had heard any voice or spoken any prophecy or anointed any king, Samuel's existence was a testimony to the faithfulness of a God who hears the prayers of barren women weeping in temples and remembers them and answers them in his time. Hannah kept the child until she had weaned him. And when she had weaned him, she took him up with her, along with a 3-year-old bull, an ephah of flour, and a skin of wine, and she brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh. And the child was young. 1 Samuel 1 verse 24, and the child was young. The detail is heartbreaking in its simplicity. He was young. Perhaps 3 years old. Perhaps a little older. Old enough to be weaned. Young enough that the distance between his mother's arms and the temple at Shiloh where he would now live was a distance too enormous for a small child to fully comprehend. Hannah brought him. She kept her vow. The woman who had wept for years for the gift of a son brought that son to the temple and gave him back. She said to Eli, "Oh, my Lord. As you live, my Lord, I am the woman who was standing here in your presence, praying to the Lord. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord." And he worshipped the Lord there. 1 Samuel 1 verses 26 to 28, I have lent him to the Lord. The word translated lent in the Hebrew is sha'al, the same root as Samuel's name, the word for asked. I asked him from the Lord, and I am giving him back to the Lord, as long as he lives. The prayer that had conceived him in the asking was now being completed in the giving. Hannah had received the son she had prayed for and was now doing what she had promised, placing him in the temple at Shiloh, in the care of the old priest Eli, to serve the Lord all the days of his life. And then she prayed again. The prayer of Hannah recorded in 1 Samuel 2 verses 1 to 10 is one of the great prayers of the Old Testament, a magnificent poem of praise and theological declaration that has been compared by scholars across centuries to the Magnificat of Mary in the New Testament. So close are the two prayers in their structure and their theological content and their celebration of the God who reverses human fortunes, who lifts the humble and brings down the proud, who fills the hungry and sends the rich away empty. Luke 1 verses 46 to 55, My heart exults in the Lord, Hannah sang. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you. There is no rock like our God. 1 Samuel 2 verses 1 to 2. The woman who had wept bitterly was singing. The woman who had poured out her soul in anguish was exulting. Not because her circumstances had become easy, she was leaving her small son in a temple and going home without him, the very son she had prayed for across years of weeping. But because she understood, in the depth of the faith that the years of barrenness had forged in her, that the God she served was the God who kills and makes alive, who brings down to Sheol and raises up, who makes poor and makes rich, who brings low and also exalts, who lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. 1 Samuel 2 verses 6 to 8, she had lived this theology in her own body. She knew it not as abstract doctrine but as personal, biographical, verifiable reality. The Lord had remembered her. The Lord had answered her. The Lord had reversed her fortune in the most tangible and intimate possible way. And now she was leaving the evidence of that reversal in the temple at Shiloh and going home to sing about it. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. 1 Samuel 2 verse 11, the boy Samuel. The asked for child. The answered prayer. The son given back before he was received. Was ministering to the Lord. In the temple. In Shiloh. Under the oversight of an old priest whose own household was becoming, simultaneously with Samuel's growing faithfulness, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong with Israel's religious leadership. And the contrast between the two, between the growing boy whose heart was oriented toward God and the failing institution whose leadership had corrupted the sacred service, would become the central dramatic tension of the next chapter of the story. The temple at Shiloh in the period of the Judges was not the magnificent cedar and gold structure that Solomon would later build in Jerusalem. It was the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that had traveled with Israel through the wilderness, that had been set up at Shiloh after the conquest of Canaan as the central place of worship for the tribes of Israel, the dwelling place of the Ark of the Covenant, the physical location where the presence of God was understood to reside among his people in a special and concentrated sense. It was an ancient and sacred space. And it was presided over by a man named Eli, whose long tenure as high priest had made him a fixture of Israelite religious life, venerable, respected, old, and deeply compromised by the behavior of his sons. Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. 1 Samuel 2 verse 12, they did not know the Lord. The phrase is devastatingly precise. These were not men who had simply made some moral mistakes or who were struggling with the ordinary temptations of human nature. They were priests, men whose entire professional and social identity was organized around the service of the God of Israel, men who stood at the altar every day and handled the sacred offerings of the people, men whose position required them above all others to know the Lord. And they did not know him. The knowledge of God that should have been the foundation of everything they did was absent. And the absence of that knowledge expressed itself in specific, documented, practical ways that Scripture records with the same unflinching honesty with which it records every other failure of God's people. The custom of the priests with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant would come, while the meat was boiling, with a three-pronged fork in his hand, and he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up the priest would take for himself. This is what they did at Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. 1 Samuel 2 verses 13 to 14, the prescribed portions that the law of Moses allocated to the priests were carefully specified, specific parts of the offering were to go to the priests as their portion, and the remainder was to be offered to God and returned to the worshipper. Leviticus 7 verses 28 to 36, Eli's sons were not taking their prescribed portion. They were taking whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted it, in whatever quantity appealed to them, inserting a fork into the cooking pot before the proper portions had been separated and taking whatever the fork brought up. The randomness and the disregard of the divinely specified allocation communicated the comprehensive nature of their contempt for the covenant order. But more than that, moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you but only raw." And if the man said to him, "Let them burn the fat first, and then take as much as you wish," he would say, "No, you must give it now, and if not, I will take it by force." Thus the sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. 1 Samuel 2 verses 15 to 17, they treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. The fat was specifically designated as the Lord's portion in the Mosaic law, the part of the sacrifice that was to be burned and offered to God before any human portion was taken. Leviticus 3 verse 16, Eli's sons were demanding their portion before God's portion had been offered, inserting their own appetite into the sequence of the sacred offering before the sacred obligation had been fulfilled. They were, in the most literal sense, putting themselves before God. taking their portion before God's portion, treating the offering of the people with contempt and, in doing so, treating the God to whom the offering was made with contempt. And they also lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. 1 Samuel 2 verse 22, the comprehensive corruption of Eli's sons extended into the most sacred space of the covenant community, the tent of meeting itself, where women who served in the religious community were subjected to the sexual predation of the men whose role was to protect and lead the sacred worship. The abuse of power in the religious sphere, the exploitation of the vulnerable by those in positions of authority, the sexual corruption of the space that was meant to be the most holy, all of it present in the priesthood of Israel simultaneously. And Eli heard about all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And he said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all these people. No, my sons. It is no good report that I hear the people of the Lord spreading abroad. If someone sins against a man, God will mediate for him, but if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him?" But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. 1 Samuel 2 verses 22 to 25, he heard. He knew. He spoke to them, weakly, in the language of a disappointed father rather than the language of a high priest with the authority and the obligation to remove corrupt men from the sacred service regardless of their family connection to him. Why do you do such things? The question of a man who could not bring himself to do what the situation required. He asked why instead of acting. He expressed disappointment instead of exercising authority. He said it is no good report instead of removing them from the priesthood. And they would not listen to the voice of their father. The spiritual condition of Shiloh in this period was comprehensive in its failure. The high priest knew about his sons' corruption and could not bring himself to act against them. The sons who held priestly positions used those positions to exploit and abuse the people they were supposed to serve. The sacred offerings were treated with contempt. The tent of meeting had been defiled. The institution that was supposed to be the living center of Israel's covenant relationship with God had become, under the leadership of Eli and his sons, a source of stumbling and scandal and contempt for the things of God rather than a source of life and guidance and the presence of the holy. Into this deeply compromised religious environment, a small boy was placed. By his mother, who had given him to God before she received him and who came year by year to Shiloh with a little robe she had made for him, a new one each year, as he grew, and brought it to him as the annual expression of a mother's love maintained across the distance that her vow had created between them. 1 Samuel 2 verse 19, the little robe. The detail is among the most tender in the entire narrative of Samuel's childhood. Hannah, who had given her son to God and kept her vow and gone home without him, did not sever the connection. She made him a robe. A new one. Every year. Carried it to Shiloh when the family went up for the annual sacrifice. The physical expression of a mother's ongoing love for a son she had released but had not stopped loving, stitching into the fabric of a small garment the same faithfulness and the same covenant commitment that had characterized the prayer that had brought him into existence. And Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, "May the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord." So then they would return to their home. And the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord. 1 Samuel 2 verses 20 to 21, the Lord visited Hannah again. The woman who had asked for 1 son and given him back received 5 more children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, as the Lord's response to the faithfulness of the giving. The covenant logic is consistent with the entire pattern of divine dealing with human faithfulness across the biblical narrative. The willingness to release what is most precious, to give back what God has given, results not in permanent loss but in multiplication. Hannah gave 1 son and received 5 more children. And the boy she gave grew in the presence of the Lord. He grew in the presence of the Lord. Not in the presence of his family. Not in the ordinary domestic environment of a Ramah household with a mother's daily guidance and a father's consistent example. In the presence of the Lord. In the temple at Shiloh, ministering before the Ark of the Covenant, wearing the linen ephod of priestly service, growing up in the most intimate proximity to the sacred, to the space and the symbols and the rituals of the covenant that pointed to the God who had answered his mother's prayer. And despite the corruption of the sons of Eli all around him, despite the daily evidence of what priestly ministry looked like when it was emptied of genuine knowledge of God and filled instead with self-interest and exploitation, Samuel grew in the presence of the Lord with a faithfulness and a wholeness of character that stood in complete and striking contrast to everything else that was happening in that sacred space. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. And the word of the Lord was rare in those days, there was no frequent vision. 1 Samuel 3 verse 1, the word of the Lord was rare. The vision was not frequent. The statement is a theological description of the spiritual condition of Israel in the period of the Judges, a description of a people and a religious leadership that had drifted so far from genuine covenant relationship with God that the channel of divine communication had narrowed to a trickle. Not because God had ceased to exist or had withdrawn his concern for his people, but because the condition of the priesthood, the moral state of the religious leadership, the comprehensive failure of the institution meant to be the medium of divine communication, all of it had created an environment in which the word of the Lord had very little to work with. When the designated channels of divine communication have been corrupted by the self-interest and the moral failure of those who are supposed to maintain them, the communication becomes rare. The vision becomes infrequent. The voice that should be speaking clearly through the lives and the words of the priests and the religious leaders becomes a whisper in a room full of noise. At that time Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so that he could not see, was lying down in his own place. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. 1 Samuel 3 verses 2-3, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. The lamp in the tabernacle was the menorah, the seven-branched lampstand that burned through the night in the holy place, the standing divine instruction that the lamp should burn from evening until morning before the Lord. Exodus 27 verse 21, it was tended by the priests, filled with pure olive oil, kept burning through the night as a symbol of the perpetual divine presence. It had not yet gone out. The detail communicates the specific time of night, the late hours before dawn when the lamp was burning low, when the oil was nearly spent, when the darkness before the morning was at its deepest. The old priest was lying in his place. His eyes were growing dim, the physical condition that mirrored his spiritual condition, the dimness of sight that corresponded to the dimness of spiritual discernment that had allowed him to mistake the most sincere prayer in Israel for drunkenness and to know about his son's corruption without acting against it. And the boy Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. The child whose existence was the answer to a prayer was sleeping in the most sacred space in Israel, in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant, in the place where the divine presence was concentrated in the physical and symbolic life of the covenant people. And then the Lord called Samuel. 1 Samuel 3 verse 4, in the darkness. In the deep hours before dawn. In the moment when the lamp was burning low and the old priest's eyes were dim and the word of the Lord was rare and the vision was not frequent. Into that darkness, into that rareness, into the deep night silence of the tabernacle where the last oil was burning in the lamp, the voice of God spoke. And it spoke to a boy. And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call. Lie down again." So he went and lay down. 1 Samuel 3 verse 5, he ran to Eli. Of course he did. The boy who had been placed in the temple as an infant, who had grown up under the oversight of the old priest, who knew Eli as the primary human authority in his world, when a voice called in the night, the boy ran to the most obvious human source of such a call. It was the natural, understandable, entirely reasonable response of a child who had not yet learned to distinguish the voice of God from the voice of a human being because no one had yet told him that God spoke to human beings directly, personally, in the night, by name. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. 1 Samuel 3 verse 7, he did not yet know the Lord in this specific sense, not that he was faithless or that his ministry in the temple was hollow, but that the direct, personal, spoken communication of the divine voice was something he had not yet experienced. The word had not yet been revealed to him in this form. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call, my son. Lie down again. 1 Samuel 3 verse 6, My son. Eli's address of Samuel as my son, even in the sleepy confusion of being twice woken in the night by a boy who believed he had been called, communicates the genuine affection between the old priest and the boy he had overseen since infancy. Whatever Eli's failures as a father and as a high priest, his relationship with Samuel carried the warmth of something genuinely paternal. My son. Lie down again. Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again, the third time. And he arose and went to Eli and said, Here I am, for you called me. Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. 1 Samuel 3 verse 8. Then Eli perceived. On the third repetition, the old priest whose eyesight was dim and whose discernment had failed him so many times in so many important moments, perceived. He understood what was happening. The boy was not dreaming. He was not confused. He was not coming to Eli because of some childish need for reassurance in the night. He was coming because a voice was calling him. A voice that was not Eli's. A voice that had called 3 times and had sent the child running 3 times to the wrong destination. And Eli, in the single moment of spiritual clarity recorded in his long tenure, understood it and told the boy what to do. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go, lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for your servant hears. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. And the Lord came and stood, calling as at other times, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant hears. 1 Samuel 3 verses 9 to 10, Speak, for your servant hears. The posture of the boy, lying down, in the darkness, in the deep hours before dawn, with the lamp burning low and the old priest's instruction still in his ears, was the posture of complete availability. Not, Speak, and I will decide whether to listen. Not, Speak, and I will evaluate what you say against my own understanding. Speak. For your servant hears. The word servant communicates the orientation of the one who speaks it. A servant's role is not to evaluate the instructions of the master but to receive them and act on them. Samuel placed himself before the voice of God in the posture of a servant, available, attentive, ready to hear whatever was about to be said. And what was about to be said was not comfortable. It was not the kind of inaugural divine communication that a child might have hoped for, a word of personal encouragement, a confirmation of his dedicated life, a promise of blessing and fruitful ministry. The first word God spoke directly to Samuel was a word of judgment. A word about Eli. A word about the house of Eli and the consequences that were coming for the corruption of the priesthood that Eli had presided over and failed to address. Then the Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel at which the 2 ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. On that day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house, from beginning to end. And I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever, for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. 1 Samuel 3 verses 11 to 14. The judgment was total and it was specific and it was grounded in the precise nature of Eli's failure. Not merely that his sons had done evil, that was their responsibility and their judgment to bear. But that he knew. He knew and he did not restrain them. The knowledge without action. The awareness of corruption without the willingness to exercise the authority that would have addressed it. The love for his sons that had overridden his love for the God whose service his sons were corrupting. This is what the judgment named. Not ignorance. Not misunderstanding. Knew. And did not restrain them. The inaction of the man who knew and said nothing more than why do you do such things, the inaction of a father who could not bring himself to do what the office of high priest required, had produced consequences that would not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay until morning. Then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. 1 Samuel 3 verse 15, he was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. Of course he was. He was a boy. He had just received, in the darkness before dawn, a word of judgment against the man who had cared for him since his infancy, the man whose position in his life was closest to that of a father, the man whose kindness and whose my son had been the human warmth of his childhood in the temple. He was afraid. The fear was entirely human and entirely understandable. And he did not speak until Eli called him and asked him directly, "What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. God do so to you and more also if you hide anything from me of all that he told you." 1 Samuel 3 verse 17. And Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. 1 Samuel 3 verse 18, he told him everything. The boy who was afraid to tell it told it anyway. Not because the fear had left him, but because the old priest had asked directly and had placed him under the most solemn possible obligation of complete honesty. And Samuel, who was afraid and could have softened the message, could have omitted the most devastating parts, could have given Eli a version of the divine word that was easier to receive, told him everything. He hid nothing. The faithfulness that characterized his service in the temple, the integrity that had grown in him through the years of ministry in the presence of the Lord, expressed itself in this first act of prophetic communication in the most difficult possible form, telling the whole truth to a man who loved him about a judgment that fell on that man's own house. And Eli said, "It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." 1 Samuel 3 verse 18, it is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. The response of a man who knew, in the depth of his soul, that what Samuel had told him was true. Who had no defense and offered none. Who had known about his son's corruption and had not acted, and who now, receiving the divine verdict on that failure from the mouth of a boy he had raised in the temple, did not argue or deny or seek to mitigate. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. The submission of a man who had failed and knew it and surrendered to the judgment with the only remaining expression of faith available to him, the acknowledgement that the God who was judging him was the God who was right to do so. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. And the Lord appeared again at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. 1 Samuel 3 verses 19 to 21, let none of his words fall to the ground. The prophetic mark of authenticity in ancient Israel was the fulfillment of the prophet's words. If what the prophet said came to pass, the prophet was genuine. If it did not, the prophet was false. Deuteronomy 18 verse 22, and the Lord let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground. Every word Samuel spoke in the name of the Lord was fulfilled. And all Israel knew it. From Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, the entire geographic extent of the covenant people, knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. The word of the Lord was no longer rare. The vision was no longer infrequent. The channel of divine communication that had been narrowed to almost nothing by the corruption of the established priesthood had been opened again, not through the reform of the existing institution, not through the repentance and restoration of Eli or his sons, but through the new voice that God had raised up in the darkness before dawn, in the temple at Shiloh, when the lamp was burning low and an old priest's eyes were dim and a boy lay in the presence of the ark and heard his name called. And said, "Speak, for your servant hears." The word of the Lord had returned to Israel through Samuel. But the institutional crisis that had produced the spiritual famine, the corruption of the priesthood, the defilement of the sacred service, the failure of the established religious leadership, had not yet produced its full consequences. The judgment that God had spoken to Samuel in the night was still approaching. And it arrived, as divine judgments so often do in the biblical narrative, not through a sudden and isolated supernatural event but through the very circumstances that Israel's own choices had created. The Philistines went up to fight against Israel, and Israel went out to battle against them and camped at Ebenezer, and the Philistines camped at Aphek. 1 Samuel 4 verse 1, the Philistines. The coastal people who occupied the fertile plain of Canaan's southwestern region, the people who had oppressed Israel for 40 years in the period of Samson, the military power that represented the most significant external threat to Israel's existence in the period of the Judges. They assembled for battle against Israel, and when the battle line was drawn up, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the field of battle. 1 Samuel 4 verse 2. 4,000 men. A significant military defeat. And the response of Israel's leadership to that defeat communicates with painful clarity the spiritual condition of a people who had lost the genuine knowledge of God that Ruth had found and that Samuel was trying to restore. They did not ask why. They did not examine their own faithfulness. They did not go to Samuel and seek the word of the Lord about what had happened and what it meant. They said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies." 1 Samuel 4 verse 3. Let us bring the ark. The idea was theologically catastrophic in ways that the people proposing it apparently did not understand. The Ark of the Covenant was not a magical object that could be deployed as a weapon regardless of the spiritual condition of the people who carried it. It was the physical symbol of the divine presence, present among a people in covenant faithfulness with the God whose presence it represented. To carry it into battle as if it were a talisman, as if the physical presence of the sacred object would compel divine protection regardless of covenant faithfulness, this was to treat the ark with the same contempt that Eli's sons had shown toward the sacred offerings. It was to use the symbol of God's presence in the place of the actual presence of God, to substitute the sign for the reality, the ritual object for the living relationship. So the people sent to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of God. 1 Samuel 4 verse 4, Hophni and Phinehas. The two corrupt priests who had treated the offerings of the Lord with contempt, who had lain with the women at the tent of meeting, who had not known the Lord, they were the ones accompanying the ark into battle. The most sacred object in Israel's covenant life was being carried by the most spiritually disqualified men in Israel's religious leadership. And when the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, "What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean?" And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come to the camp, the Philistines were afraid. 1 Samuel 4 verses 5 to 7. The Philistines were afraid. Their fear was rooted in genuine theological knowledge of what God had done in Egypt, knowledge of the power associated with the God of Israel and the ark that represented his presence. These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage, and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight. 1 Samuel 4 verses 8 to 9, the Philistines knew more about the power of the God of Israel than the Israelites were demonstrating in that moment. And the Philistines fought, and Israel was defeated, and they fled, every man to his home. And there was a very great slaughter, for there fell of Israel 30,000 foot soldiers. And the ark of God was captured, and the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, died. 1 Samuel 4 verses 10 to 11. The ark of God was captured. 30,000 men dead. Hophni and Phinehas dead. The judgment spoken to Samuel in the night had arrived. The word of the Lord that had been given to a boy lying in the darkness before dawn, the word that the 2 ears of everyone who heard it would tingle, had been fulfilled. Let none of his words fall to the ground. The first word God had given Samuel was a word of judgment on Eli's house. And it had come to pass exactly as spoken. A man of Benjamin ran from the battle line and came to Shiloh the same day, with his clothes torn and with dirt on his head. When he arrived, Eli was sitting on his seat by the road watching, for his heart trembled for the ark of God. And when the man came into the city and told the news, all the city cried out. When Eli heard the sound of the outcry, he said, "What is this uproar?" Then the man hurried and came and told Eli. Now Eli was 98 years old and his eyes were set so that he could not see. 1 Samuel 4 verses 12 to 15, 98 years old. His eyes set so that he could not see. The physical condition of the old priest had progressed to complete blindness, the external manifestation of the spiritual condition that had defined his final years. And his heart trembled for the ark of God. Not for his sons, for the ark. The man who had failed to restrain his sons, who had presided over the corruption of the sacred service, who had known and had not acted, in the final hours of his life, Eli's heart trembled not for his corrupt sons but for the sacred object whose capture would mean the departure of the divine presence from Israel. And the man said to Eli, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among the people. Your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the ark of God has been captured. As soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken and he died, for the man was old and heavy. He had judged Israel 40 years. 1 Samuel 4 verses 17 to 18, he fell over backward and his neck was broken. The man who had been the spiritual authority of Israel for 40 years died at the news of the ark's capture. Not at the news of his sons' deaths, the messenger reported both in sequence, and it was the ark, not the sons, that broke Eli. The things that had been closest to Eli's heart in his old age, the ark, the presence of God, the sacred symbols of the covenant, were the things whose loss he could not survive. And the wife of Phinehas, who was with child, near the time of giving birth, heard the news that the ark of God was captured and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead. She bowed and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death the women attending her said to her, Do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. And she named the child Ichabod, saying, The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. She said, The glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured. 1 Samuel 4 verses 19 to 22. Ichabod. The name means where is the glory or the glory has departed. A child named in dying by a dying woman as the living embodiment of the theological reality of the moment, the glory of the Lord had departed from Israel. The ark was in Philistine hands. The high priest was dead. His corrupt sons were dead. The battle had been lost catastrophically. And a child was born and named after the departure of the divine glory. The house of Eli had ended not in gentle retirement but in the precise fulfillment of the judgment spoken to a boy in the darkness before dawn, the word that the Lord had let none fall to the ground. But the ark's journey among the Philistines was not the story of the divine glory extinguished. It was the story of the divine glory demonstrating, in Philistine territory, that the capture of the ark by human military power did not place God under human control. The Philistines took the ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it up beside Dagon. 1 Samuel 5 verse 2, Dagon, the principal deity of the Philistine religious system, the god of grain and fertility whose temples stood in the major Philistine cities. The Philistines placed the ark of the God of Israel beside their own God, the gesture of a conquering people incorporating the divine symbol of the defeated enemy into their own religious space, the ancient Near Eastern convention of gods being captured along with the peoples who worshipped them. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. 1 Samuel 5 verse 3, face downward. Before the ark. The posture of worship. Dagon, the god of the Philistines, was found prostrate before the ark of Israel's God, not placed that way by human hands but having fallen in the night into the posture that the truth of the divine reality required of every other claimed deity. They took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early on the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. 1 Samuel 5 verse 4. The head and the hands cut off. The symbolic dismemberment of the Philistine deity, head representing divine intelligence and authority, hands representing divine power and capability, communicated by the physical condition of the idol what the theological reality already declared. Dagon had no head. Dagon had no hands. The God of Israel, whose ark sat in the same room, was not one God among many. He was not the God of a defeated people who had been overcome by a superior military force. He was the God before whom every other claimed deity fell prostrate. And the ark in Philistine territory was demonstrating exactly the same truth that the ark in Israelite territory was supposed to represent, the absolute supremacy of the God of Israel over every other power, human or claimed divine. And the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod, and he terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. 1 Samuel 5 verse 6, the tumors spread with the ark, wherever the Philistines moved it, the affliction followed. From Ashdod to Gath to Ekron, the presence of the ark produced plague and terror and the cry of the dying. 1 Samuel 5 verses 8 to 12, the Philistine lords gathered to determine what to do with the ark that had become a catastrophe in their midst. And after 7 months of the ark in Philistine territory, 7 months of plague and affliction and the prostrate idol and the terror of a divine presence that refused to behave like a captured god, the Philistines sent it back. With guilt offerings. With golden tumors and golden mice as atonement for what they had done. They put it on a new cart and sent it back toward Israel, toward the territory of Beth Shemesh. 1 Samuel 6 verses 1 to 12. And the men of Beth Shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and they lifted up their eyes and saw the ark and rejoiced to see it. 1 Samuel 6 verse 13, the ark had come home. Not through military recovery. Not through Israel's strength or Israel's planning. Through the sovereign action of the God whose presence in Philistine territory had been so catastrophically disruptive to the Philistine world that the most powerful military confederation in the region had decided that returning it was preferable to keeping it. The God who had seemed defeated in the loss of the ark at Ebenezer had been demonstrating throughout those 7 months, in Philistine cities and Philistine temples and the prostrate form of Dagon without his head and his hands, that the capture of his symbol by human military power was not the capture of him. And Samuel grew in stature and in favor with the Lord and with men. The boy who had heard the voice of God in the night while everyone else slept had grown into the man through whom God was about to address the crisis of Israel's spiritual condition with the same directness and the same faithfulness that he had demonstrated when he told Eli everything and hid nothing. The word of the Lord was no longer rare. The vision was no longer infrequent. And the voice of the prophet who let none of his words fall to the ground was about to call Israel to the most fundamental act of covenant renewal available to a people who had wandered far from the God who had made them. Then Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, saying, If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth from among you and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So Israel put away the Baals and the Ashtaroth, and they served the Lord only. 1 Samuel 7 verses 3 to 4, If you are returning to the Lord with all your heart. The condition was simple and comprehensive and demanding simultaneously. Not a ritual. Not a sacrifice. Not a ceremony. A direction of the heart. A putting away of the competing loyalties and the foreign gods and the Ashtaroth that had accumulated in Israel's religious life during the long years of the judges. A turning. A returning. With all the heart. Serve him only. And Israel did it. They put away the foreign gods. They served the Lord only. And Samuel said, Gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord and fasted on that day and said there, We have sinned against the Lord. 1 Samuel 7 verses 5 to 6, We have sinned against the Lord. The confession that had been absent across so many years of the judges' cycle, the clear, direct, unambiguous acknowledgement of sin before the God who had been sinned against, was now being offered. At Mizpah. Before Samuel. By all Israel gathered together. The word of God that had been rare was now producing the fruit that the word of God was always intended to produce. Repentance, return, the direction of the heart back toward the God who had been waiting for exactly this. And the Philistines heard that Israel had gathered at Mizpah. And the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the people of Israel said to Samuel, "Do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines." So Samuel took a nursing lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. 1 Samuel 7 verses 7-9. The Lord answered him. The God who had been silent during the long years of the judges, whose word had been rare and whose vision had been infrequent, answered the prayer of the man whose words he let none of fall to the ground. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But the Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines and threw them into confusion, and they were defeated before Israel. 1 Samuel 7 verse 10, the Lord thundered. Not Israel's army. Not a military strategy. The God who had seemed defeated at Ebenezer when the ark was taken thundered against the Philistines at Mizpah when a repentant Israel cried out to him through a prophet who had heard his voice in the darkness before dawn. And Israel pursued the Philistines and struck them as far as below Beth-kar. 1 Samuel 7 verse 11. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen and called its name Ebenezer, for he said, "Till now the Lord has helped us." 1 Samuel 7 verse 12, Ebenezer. The stone of help. The same name as the place of Israel's catastrophic defeat when they had carried the ark into battle with corrupt priests and an unreturned heart, now the name of a memorial stone marking the victory that had come when Israel returned to the Lord with all their heart and the prophet of the Lord cried out to the God who answers. The name that had marked the place of defeat became the name of the stone that marked the place of divine rescue. God had redeemed even the name of the disaster. Till now the Lord has helped us. The acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment, the barren woman's prayer, the boy in the temple, the voice in the night, the unflinching telling of the word of judgment, the long years of prophetic faithfulness, the gathering at Mizpah and the confession and the cry to God, all of it contained in those 5 words. Till now. The Lord has helped us. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would return to Ramah, for his home was there, and there also he judged Israel. And he built there an altar to the Lord. 1 Samuel 7 verses 15-17, the rhythm of Samuel's prophetic and judicial ministry was the rhythm of a man who understood that the word of God required not a single dramatic moment of delivery but the sustained, daily, geographically distributed presence of someone through whom that word continued to be available to the people. He traveled. Year after year. Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah and back to Ramah. The circuit of the prophet, not settled in one place where the people had to come to him, but moving through the territory of Israel, available, present, consistent. The word of the Lord that had been rare was now carried through the land on the feet of a man who had heard it in the night and had never stopped listening. For years, the arrangement worked. Samuel judged. Israel lived under the word of the Lord mediated through the prophet. The Philistine threat was contained. The spiritual condition of the people, while not perfect, was significantly better than the comprehensive corruption of the period of the judges. And Samuel grew old. As Eli had grown old before him. As all human leaders grow old, the irreversible biological reality of time doing to the human body what it does to every human body, reducing the capacity for the circuit of Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah, requiring that thought be given to what would come after. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They judged at Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. 1 Samuel 8 verses 1-3, his sons did not walk in his ways. The echo of Eli was unmistakable and devastating. The man who had been placed in the temple as a child because his mother had given him to God, the man who had grown up watching the corruption of Eli's sons with presumably full awareness of what that corruption had produced, had sons who did not walk in his ways. The cycle that had defined the period of the judges reasserted itself even in the household of the greatest judge of that period. Sons who turned aside after gain. Sons who took bribes. Sons who perverted justice. Different specific sins from the sins of Hophni and Phinehas, but the same essential reality, men placed in positions of spiritual and judicial authority who used those positions for self-enrichment rather than covenant faithfulness. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, Behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. 1 Samuel 8 verses 4-5, Appoint for us a king like all the nations. The request came from the elders, from the established leadership of the tribes of Israel, from the men who had been watching Samuel's sons at Beersheba and had calculated that the prophetic and judicial model of governance that had served Israel through Samuel's lifetime was not going to survive the succession. They wanted a king. Not because they had thought carefully about the theological implications of what they were asking. Not because they had consulted the word of the Lord about whether kingship was the divinely preferred form of governance for the covenant people. But because the nations around them had kings, and kingship looked like stability, and the failure of Samuel's sons had created an anxiety about the future that the elders were proposing to address with the most obvious available solution. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, Give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. 1 Samuel 8 verses 6-7, They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me. God's interpretation of the people's request cut through the surface of what was being asked to its theological core. Israel asking for a king like all the nations was not primarily a political request or an administrative preference. It was a theological statement, a declaration that the covenant arrangement in which God was the king of Israel and the human judges and prophets were his representatives was insufficient. That what Israel wanted was what the nations had. A visible, permanent, hereditary human king. The ultimate human authority rather than the divine authority mediated through prophetic and priestly leadership. They have rejected me from being king over them. The grief in that divine statement is palpable. Not anger alone, though there was righteous anger at the rejection. But grief. The grief of the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt, who had carried them through the wilderness, who had given them the land, who had raised up judges and prophets to guide them, who had thundered against the Philistines at Mizpah when they returned to him, that God was being told that the arrangement by which he had been their king was not enough. They wanted what the nations had. They wanted a king like all the nations. And in wanting to be like all the nations, they were rejecting the very thing that made them different from the nations, the covenant relationship with the God who was their king. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. 1 Samuel 8 verses 8-9, Obey their voice. God's instruction to Samuel was not to refuse the request but to honor it, with full disclosure. To give the people what they were asking for, but first to show them what they were asking for. The ways of the king. The manner of his reign. The cost of kingship in practical, tangible, daily terms that the elders who had come to Ramah with their request had not fully calculated. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He will take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and to his servants. He will take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys, and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. 1 Samuel 8 verses 10-18. He will take. The repetition is deliberate and comprehensive. He will take your sons. He will take your daughters. He will take the best of your fields. He will take the tenth of your grain. He will take your male servants. He will take the tenth of your flocks. 7 times the word take appears in Samuel's description of the manner of kingship. The king would be defined by taking, by the systematic extraction of the people's children, their labor, their land, their agricultural produce, their animals, their freedom. You shall be his slaves. The most devastating word in the entire description, the people who had been slaves in Egypt and had been brought out by the mighty hand of God were choosing, with their eyes open, a form of governance that would make them slaves again. This time not to a foreign pharaoh but to their own king. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. 1 Samuel 8 verses 19-20, that we also may be like all the nations. The explicit statement of the desire, not merely for better governance, not merely for the practical benefits of kingship, but for the fundamental thing that kingship represented. Likeness to the nations. The surrender of the distinctiveness that the covenant with God had given Israel, the willingness to trade being the people of God, governed by God, distinctive among the nations as the covenant people of the Lord of hosts, for the comfort of looking like everybody else. We want to be like all the nations. The theological tragedy was complete and explicit and voluntarily chosen. And the Lord said to Samuel, Obey their voice and make them a king. 1 Samuel 8 verse 22, Give them what they asked for. Honor the choice they have made with full information. And live with the consequences, as they will live with the consequences, of the moment when God's own people looked at the gift of divine kingship and decided it was not enough. Samuel heard the word of the Lord. And then, with the faithfulness that had characterized every act of his prophetic ministry since the night he had lain in the temple and said, Speak, for your servant hears, Samuel began the work of finding the king the people had asked for. And the Lord told him exactly where to look. There was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, a man of wealth. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a handsome young man. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. 1 Samuel 9 verses 1-2. Handsome. Tall. A man of impressive physical presence, everything that the human eye looks for when scanning a room for a king. And Samuel anointed him. In private first, pouring the flask of oil on Saul's head and kissing him and saying, Has not the Lord anointed you to be prince over his people Israel? And you shall reign over the people of the Lord and you will save them from the hand of their surrounding enemies. 1 Samuel 10 verse 1, and then publicly, before all the people at Mizpah, the same Mizpah where Samuel had gathered Israel for confession and prayer and where the Lord had thundered against the Philistines. The same Mizpah where the stone of Ebenezer had been set up with the words, Till now the Lord has helped us. At that Mizpah, before all the people, the first king of Israel was presented. And Samuel said to all the people, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted, Long live the king. 1 Samuel 10 verse 24, Long live the king. The shout that Israel had asked for, the celebration of the human monarch, the visible king like all the nations, the man from whose shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. They had their king. And Samuel, who had prayed to the Lord and received the divine instruction and anointed the man the Lord had shown him and presented him to all the people, Samuel stood before the people he had served his entire life and said one more thing. Then Samuel said to the people, The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. And they said, He is witness. 1 Samuel 12 verse 5, the accountability of the prophet, the declaration before God and the people that across the entire length of his ministry, he had not taken from them what the king Samuel had just described would take. He had not enriched himself at their expense. He had not used his position of authority and influence to extract from the people the sons and daughters and fields and flocks and labor that he had warned them a king would take. His hands were clean. The ministry he had performed across the full arc of his life, from the night in the temple to the anointing at Mizpah, had been the ministry of a servant who took nothing for himself. And Samuel said to the people, "Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. For the Lord will not forsake his people, for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you, and I will instruct you in the good and the right way." 1 Samuel 12 verses 20-23. Far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. The statement of the prophet's ongoing commitment, even after the people had rejected the divine kingship that he had been the instrument of maintaining, even after they had asked for a king like all the nations, even after the request that God himself had described as a rejection of his own kingship, Samuel would not stop praying for them. He defined the cessation of intercession as a sin against the Lord. The same prophet who had been afraid to tell Eli the word of judgment but had told it anyway because faithfulness required it, was now declaring that faithfulness required him to keep praying for a people who had done all this evil. Not as a reward for their faithfulness. Not as a recognition of their deserving. But because they were the people of the Lord, and the Lord would not forsake his people for his great name's sake, and the prophet of the Lord was not going to forsake them either. The ministry of Samuel was the ministry of a man who understood that prophetic faithfulness is not conditional on the responsiveness of the people being served. That prayer for a people continues even when the people have made choices that grieve the God who called them. That the word of the Lord must be spoken regardless of whether it is welcome. That the instruction in the good and the right way must be offered even to people who have just demonstrated their preference for the wrong way. He would pray. He would instruct. He would continue to be the presence of the Word of God among a people who had just elected to be governed by a human king. Because the word of the Lord had not been rare in Israel since the night it had come to a boy lying in the temple at Shiloh. And Samuel was not going to allow it to become rare again. The king the people had asked for did not last. Saul, tall, handsome, impressive by every external measure, the king the people's eyes had chosen, revealed across the years of his reign the fundamental flaw that the outward appearance had concealed. The flaw was not military incompetence or political failure, though those eventually came. The flaw was the same flaw that had undone Eli and his sons, the same flaw that had characterized Israel's repeated cycle of faithlessness in the period of the Judges, the same flaw that runs through the entire human story like a thread of darkness woven into the fabric of every life that has not been fully surrendered to God. Saul could not fully obey. He could partially obey. He could obey the parts of the divine command that were convenient and leave the parts that cost him something. He could honor God when obedience was easy and find reasons to deviate when obedience was costly. And in the economy of the covenant, partial obedience is not obedience. It is a form of disobedience that is more dangerous than outright rebellion because it wears the costume of faithfulness. The first major rupture came at Gilgal. Samuel had told Saul to wait 7 days at Gilgal, to wait for the prophet to arrive and offer the burnt offering before going into battle against the Philistines. 1 Samuel 13 verse 8, the instruction was specific. The time was specified. 7 days. Wait. And Saul waited. Until the 7th day, when Samuel had not come and the people were beginning to scatter and the Philistine threat was pressing and the pressure of the moment and the fear of military disadvantage overwhelmed the specific instruction he had been given. So Saul said, "Bring the burnt offering here to me and the peace offerings." And he offered the burnt offering. 1 Samuel 13 verse 9. He had barely finished when Samuel arrived. And Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul said, "When I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the days appointed, and that the Philistines had mustered at Michmash, I said, Now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the favor of the Lord." So I forced myself, and offered the burnt offering. 1 Samuel 13 verses 11 to 12, I forced myself. The explanation of a man who had done what he knew was wrong and was explaining why the circumstances had made it necessary. The fear of what would happen if he did not act. The scattering of the people. The failure of the prophet to arrive exactly on time. The Philistine threat pressing in from Michmash. All real. All present. All insufficient as grounds for the violation of a specific divine instruction. The circumstances that Saul described were the circumstances that the test was designed to produce. The question was not whether Saul could obey when obedience was easy, but whether he could obey when obedience was costly and frightening, and when every human calculation suggested that deviation was necessary. And Samuel said to Saul, "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." 1 Samuel 13 verses 13 to 14, the Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. The first announcement of what was coming, the first indication that the divine search for the next king had already begun, that somewhere in Israel there was a man whose heart was oriented toward God in the way that Saul's was not, and that the kingdom that Saul's disobedience had forfeited was going to be given to that man. The second rupture was worse. The Lord sent Saul on a mission against the Amalekites, the people who had attacked Israel from behind during the wilderness journey, who had come against the weak and the weary and the stragglers at the tail of the column when Israel was vulnerable. 1 Samuel 15 verse 2, the instruction was total and specific: destroy everything, spare nothing. 1 Samuel 15 verse 3, and Saul attacked and defeated the Amalekites. But he did not destroy everything. Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. 1 Samuel 15 verse 9. He kept the king alive. He kept the best of the animals. He destroyed the worthless and the despised but preserved the valuable. And when Samuel came to him the next morning, Saul greeted him with the confident announcement of obedience. Blessed be you to the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. 1 Samuel 15 verse 13, I have performed the commandment of the Lord. Said by a man who had not performed the commandment of the Lord. Said with the apparent sincerity of someone who had partially complied and had convinced himself that partial compliance constituted the performance of the full command. Then what is this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen that I hear? 1 Samuel 15 verse 14, Samuel's question was devastating in its simplicity. The evidence of the disobedience was audible. The sheep and the oxen that should have been destroyed were making their existence known in the only way animals can, by being there, by bleating and lowing, by the inescapable fact of their continued presence in a situation where they should not have been present. The disobedience was not a theoretical matter or a philosophical question about the boundaries of the divine command. It was bleating. It was lowing. It was the concrete, physical, undeniable evidence that something had been kept that was supposed to be devoted to destruction. And Saul said, They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, and the rest we have devoted to destruction. 1 Samuel 15 verse 15, the people. The shift of blame was immediate and instinctive. Not I spared them, they spared them. The people. And then the rationalization, to sacrifice to the Lord your God. The best of what should have been destroyed was going to be offered to God. The disobedience was being wrapped in the language of worship. The deviation from the divine command was being presented as an act of religious devotion. And in doing so, Saul revealed something about his understanding of God that was the root of all his failures, the belief that what God most wanted was the external performance of religious acts, and that such performances could be substituted for the specific obedience to specific divine commands. And Samuel said, Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. 1 Samuel 15 verses 22-23, to obey is better than sacrifice. The statement is one of the great prophetic declarations of the entire Old Testament, a sentence that cuts through the confusion between religious performance and genuine covenant faithfulness with the clarity of a sword. God does not want the fat of rams if what he asked for was obedience. He does not want burnt offerings if what he commanded was the destruction of the Amalekites. The religious act does not substitute for the covenant act. The worship does not compensate for the disobedience. Rebellion is as the sin of divination. Presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. The sins Saul had committed in his partial obedience and his self-justification were not minor deviations from the covenant. They were the functional equivalent of the most serious covenant violations: divination, iniquity, idolatry. Because they shared with those sins the same root, the placing of human judgment above divine command, the decision that what God had said could be modified by human calculation of what would produce the best outcome. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. The rejection was mutual. Saul had rejected the word. The Lord rejected Saul. The symmetry was exact and the justice was complete. And Samuel said to Saul, I will not return with you. For you have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you from being king over Israel. 1 Samuel 15 verse 26, as Samuel turned to go away, Saul seized the skirt of his robe, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day and has given it to a neighbor of yours, who is better than you. 1 Samuel 15 verses 27-28. The torn robe. The physical sign of the torn kingdom. Samuel's garment ripping in Saul's desperate grasp, communicating in tactile, immediate, irreversible terms what had just happened to the kingdom that Saul had been given and had forfeited through his presumptuous disobedience. The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day. Not eventually. Not when the consequences became politically visible. This day. The tearing was already done. Whatever continued externally in terms of Saul's reign, the divine verdict had already been rendered and would not be reversed. And Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul. And the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. 1 Samuel 15 verse 35, Samuel grieved over Saul. The man who had anointed him. The man whose kingship had been the answer to Israel's request and the beginning of the long era of the monarchy. The man whose failure had been total and whose rejection had been complete. Samuel grieved over him. Not with vindictive satisfaction at the fulfillment of the prophetic word of judgment. With grief. The same kind of grief that God expressed, the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king. The grief of genuine love watching genuine failure reach its inevitable conclusion. The sorrow of a prophet who had served faithfully and watched the king he had anointed squander what he had been given. And the Lord said to Samuel, How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil, and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. 1 Samuel 16 verse 1, Fill your horn with oil. The same horn of oil that had been used to anoint Saul was to be filled again, the same sacred act of anointing, the same divine commission, the same covenant appointment of a human king. But this time, at the direction of the God who looks not on the outward appearance but on the heart. And Samuel came to Bethlehem. And when Jesse and his sons came to the sacrifice, Samuel looked at Eliab and thought, Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. 1 Samuel 16 verses 6-7, Do not look on the outward appearance. The word that God had spoken to Samuel at Bethlehem was the word that reversed every human calculation about where power and worth and divine favor reside. Not the tall one. Not the impressive one. Not the one whose appearance communicates strength and capability and the conventional markers of leadership. The Lord looks on the heart. 7 sons passed before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these. Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." 1 Samuel 16 verses 10 to 12. Arise, anoint him, for this is he. The same pattern as the divine identification of Samuel himself, the unlikely one, the overlooked one, the one nobody thought to bring in from the fields because nobody considered him a serious candidate. David. The youngest. The shepherd. The one whose father had not even included in the presentation. The one the Lord saw when no human eye was looking in his direction. This is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. 1 Samuel 16 verse 13, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. The prophetic act was complete. The king of God's own choosing, chosen not for height or appearance but for the heart that God had looked on and found oriented toward him, had been anointed. And Samuel went back to Ramah. Back to the circuit of his ministry. Back to the life of prayer and instruction and the faithful carrying of the word of the Lord that had defined his entire existence from the night a voice had called him in the darkness and he had said, "Speak, for your servant hears." Samuel died. And all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. 1 Samuel 25 verse 1, all Israel assembled and mourned. The mourning of all Israel for Samuel was the mourning of a people who understood, perhaps only fully in the moment of his absence, what they had had in him. The prophet who had let none of his words fall to the ground. The judge who had traveled the circuit of Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah and Ramah year after year. The man who had told Eli everything and hid nothing. The man who had warned the people about the ways of the king and anointed the king they asked for anyway and committed himself to pray for them even after they rejected the divine kingship. The man who had said to the Lord, "Speak, for your servant hears," and had spent his entire life acting on what he heard. The story of Samuel is, at its deepest level, a story about the nature of divine calling and the cost of prophetic faithfulness. About what it means to be consecrated before birth and given back to God before you are received. About what it means to grow up in the presence of corruption without being corrupted. About what it means to hear the voice of God in the darkness and to speak what you hear regardless of how unwelcome it is, regardless of who it is to, regardless of the personal cost of the speaking. About what it means to continue praying for people who have rejected everything you represented and to define the cessation of that prayer as a sin against the Lord. Samuel was a bridge. He was the bridge between the era of the judges and the era of the kings, the transitional figure through whom the covenant story moved from one form to the next. He was the last of the judges and the first of the prophets in the sense that would define the prophetic office through the rest of Israel's history. And in him, the word of the Lord that had been rare became again the word that was heard, that went out through the land from Dan to Beersheba, that let none of its words fall to the ground, that spoke hard truths to the powerful and tender truths to the grieving and urgent truths to the people who needed to return to the Lord with all their heart. The writer of Hebrews, in the great catalogue of faith in the 11th chapter, listed Samuel among the cloud of witnesses, among those who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. Hebrews 11 verses 32 to 33, not the most famous name in that list. Not the most dramatically storied. But there, because the faith that had moved Samuel to lie down in the temple and say, "Speak, for your servant hears," was the faith of a man who had made himself completely available to the Word of God and had spent his entire life acting on that availability. The faith that took the message of judgment to the man who had raised him and hid nothing. The faith that told the people exactly what a king would cost them and anointed the king they asked for anyway. The faith that went to Bethlehem with a horn full of oil and looked past the tall and the impressive and the obvious and anointed the shepherd boy who became the king after God's own heart. And the boy who had heard God's voice while everyone else slept became the man who ensured that the voice of God would not fall silent in Israel again. Who built into the office of the prophet a standard of faithfulness, "Let none of my words fall to the ground," that the prophets who came after him would aspire to and struggle toward and sometimes achieve across the centuries of Israel's story that followed. Who demonstrated, in the simplest and most complete possible form, what it looks like when a human life is genuinely, fully, unconditionally available to the Word of God. Speak, Lord. For your servant hears. 5 words. The posture of a lifetime. The definition of the prophetic calling. The invitation that Samuel extended to the God who had been looking for a voice, a human voice, a faithful voice, a voice that would speak what it heard without softening the hard parts and without inflating the comfortable parts and without ceasing even when the people it was speaking to had rejected everything the voice represented. The lamp of God had not yet gone out when Samuel heard the voice. And from that night forward, through all the years of his ministry and all the words he spoke and all the kings he anointed and all the prayers he offered for a people who deserved none of them, the lamp did not go out. The word was not rare. The vision was not infrequent. Because a boy had lain in the darkness and made himself available. And the God who had been waiting for exactly that availability had spoken. And the boy had listened. And the world had never been quite the same since.